Hello, I'm doing a book review, and the book I want to review is The Sandman Volume 10, The Wake. Now, this is the 10th and final volume of Neil Gaiman's Sandman series. Now, The Sandman is a dark fantasy comic book series written by Neil Gaiman and published by Vertigo, which is an imprint of DC Comics. Now, the series was originally published in single magazine form between the years 1989 and 1996, and then later on all the issues of the series were collected into 10 volumes. Now, I've already reviewed the other volumes in this series, and I'll leave links in the description below to where you can check out my reviews on the other Sandman books. Now, while this is primarily a dark fantasy series, the series also incorporates elements of horror, black comedy, satire, drama, and even elements of the superhero genre, because these comics are set in the DC universe, or at least they're set in a universe where characters like Superman, Batman, Wonder Woman, and the other members of the Justice League exist. But personally, I kind of like to think of the stuff published under Vertigo as being in its own universe. Now, the whole concept of this series is what if when we dream we're actually going into another dimension known as the Dreamin', and the series follows a character named Morpheus, who is the king of the Dreamin'. Now, Morpheus is part of a group of celestial beings known as the Endless. Now, the other members of the Endless are Destiny, Death, Destruction, Desire, Despair, and Delirium. Now, nobody knows exactly what the Endless are or where they came from, but it is implied that they are billions of years old. Like, they are among the oldest and most powerful beings in the universe, and I've always gotten the implication that they're even older than our known universe, and possibly even older than God. Now, in a lot of ways, The Wake is not properly a story, rather it's an epilogue to the entire series, and I almost feel that this should have been published along with The Kindly Ones, which was Volume 9. Like, I almost feel like this and The Kindly Ones should have been published together as one volume. Like, for all intents and purposes, The Kindly Ones was really the final book in this series, and this is really just the coda. Now, in order to explain this volume, I will have to give away some major plot spoilers of what happened in The Kindly Ones. Now, in The Kindly Ones, a baby boy named Daniel Hull, who has a very special connection to the Dreamin', was kidnapped by the Norse god Loki and a sprite named Robin Goodfellow, and Daniel's mother believed that Morpheus was the one who took her child. So, with help from the Furies, she waged war against the Dreamin', and Morpheus realized that the only way to save the Dreamin' was to sacrifice himself, so he had his sister Death kill him, and the baby boy Daniel became merged with the essence of Dream, and he became the new Dream of the Endless, the new Sandman, essentially. So basically, the plot of The Wake is you have Daniel Hull trying to come to terms with what exactly he is, and accept his role as the new Sandman. Meanwhile, there's a funeral and a wake being held for the old Sandman, Morpheus, the character we've come to know in the 9 graphic novels leading up to this. And the implication that I got is that basically every being in the universe is at Morpheus's wake and funeral. Again, this is the dream world where anything is possible. And you see people show up to this funeral who, while they're awake, probably have no idea who Morpheus is, but it's almost playing on this idea that all beings in the universe are subconsciously aware of Morpheus. So you have literally every being on Earth and other planets throughout the universe show up to this wake. And throughout the comic, you see normal humans alongside gods, angels, and even the devil himself saying goodbye to Morpheus. And I thought that was really cool. It's almost this idea that dreams are the one thing that connects all of us. And because this series is more or less set in the DC universe, you do get some interesting cameos, like at one point you see Superman, Batman, and Martian Manhunter. And I think it's really interesting how Superman is dreaming of himself as Clark Kent, whereas Batman is dreaming of himself not as Bruce Wayne, but as Batman. You also see John Constantine standing alongside Dr. Occult and the Phantom Stranger. You even see Darkseid, who's primarily a Superman villain, at Morpheus's funeral. And of course you see the other members of the Endless saying their goodbyes to Morpheus, except for Destruction. Destruction does show up in this comic, but he doesn't actually attend the funeral. And ultimately what this volume is it's a goodbye. It's a goodbye to this character, and it's a goodbye to this series. I also really liked the characterization of Matthew in this. Now, Matthew is a Raven who used to be a human. He was a man named Matt Cable who died, but after he died, instead of going to heaven or hell, he went into the Dream-In and became Morpheus's Raven. And here you see Matthew really struggling with the death of his friend, but also struggling to accept Daniel as the new Sandman. Now, most of the issues collected in here, with the exception of the last two issues, were illustrated by Michael Zulli, and I just want to say I absolutely adore the artwork in here. Honestly, this might be my favorite artwork in the entire series. Now, after the main story, you get an epilogue called Sunday Morning, and this and the last two issues collected in here really work as standalone stories. Now, Sunday Morning follows an immortal named Hob, who we were introduced to in this series before. Hob is a man who was granted immortality by Morpheus in the year 1389. But this epilogue follows Hob going to a Renaissance fair with his girlfriend. Now, his girlfriend has no idea that he's actually a 600-year-old immortal. And Hob is being kind of a drunk asshole to everybody there, and he's also pointing out all the historical inaccuracies because he actually lived through the Renaissance, which obviously nobody there realizes. And the story is really about Hob starting to regret his immortality because he's seen people around him who he's grown to love die. And it's also about him coming to terms with the death of Morpheus, who he became really good friends with over the centuries. But Sunday Morning is a great epilogue to the Wake story. At the same time, it really does work as a great standalone, and it touches on a lot of really moving themes about grief and loss and regret and redemption. And I think it's really interesting that Hob's girlfriend is a black woman, because Hob was alive during the slave trade, and he actually took part in the slave trade, and it was actually Morpheus who convinced him that that's wrong. So you can tell that Hob also feels tremendous guilt over what he did to his girlfriend's people in the past, even though she has no idea what he did. Also in this epilogue, there is sort of a hint that Morpheus might still be alive on some other plane of existence. After the epilogue, you get a standalone story called Exiles, which is set in China during the 18th or 19th century, and it follows a former advisor to the Emperor of China, who is now in exile after his son has joined the White Lotus Rebellion. Now, this story is sort of a companion piece to an earlier Sandman story called Soft Places, because the main character of this story, while traveling through the desert, gets lost in a soft place, which is a place where the line between dreams and reality starts to become blurred and time becomes non-linear. And the main character starts meeting people from different time periods, and he starts seeing things from the future, and he does eventually meet Morpheus and Daniel. But this was a really good standalone story with some really interesting themes about fatherhood and forgiveness. And the final issue collected in here is called The Tempest, which is set hundreds of years before the main events of the story, and it takes its title from the William Shakespeare play, The Tempest, and William Shakespeare is actually the main character of this final chapter. Now, Shakespeare was introduced as a character earlier in the series, where you found out that Shakespeare and Morpheus had sort of a bargain with each other, and this story is really about the conclusion of that bargain, and the story is taking place while Shakespeare is writing his play The Tempest. Now, even though this story is taking place centuries before the main events of the series, this really does work as a great conclusion to the series because, in a lot of ways, and Gaiman even said this, that this story is really a story about endings. So it's very fitting that a story about endings is the actual ending to the entire series. So I definitely recommend The Wake. Obviously you have to read the other volumes in order to read this one, but this is a great conclusion to, in my opinion, an amazing series. Like, The Sandman is not just a great comic book series, but this is also a great piece of fantasy literature. And that's the thing, people like Neil Gaiman and Alan Moore really did sort of bridge that gap between comic books and literature. And it was really this series, along with stuff like Frank Miller's The Dark Knight Returns, and Alan Moore's Watchmen, and Art Spiegelman's Mouse, that really showed that comic books can be for adults as well, and comic books can be serious and actually be literature. Now, while this was the final volume of the original run of Sandman, this technically wasn't the end of the series. A few years after this, Neil Gaiman did a novel called The Dream Hunters, which was not a graphic novel, it was an actual prose novel that happened to take place in the Sandman universe, but it took place years and years before the main events of the series. That was followed by a graphic novel called Endless Nights, which dealt with the other members of the Endless, but again, I think that graphic novel was mostly taking place before the main events of this series. And then between 2013 and 2015, Neil Gaiman did a series called The Sandman Overture, which was a direct prequel to the first volume of this series. And right now there's a new series called The Sandman Universe, which I actually have the first issue of, and it's not actually written by Neil Gaiman, but he's sort of like overseeing it. Now, the character of Daniel Hall has appeared in other DC comics not written by Neil Gaiman. Now, this series has had multiple spin-offs made to it, like the character of Death, she got her own spin-off series, and she's also appeared in other DC and Vertigo comics. Of course, Neil Gaiman's version of the Devil, Lucifer Morningstar, he got his own spin-off series called Lucifer, which was the basis for the show Lucifer on Fox. And several other characters from this series have also gotten their own spin-offs. Now, Netflix is currently developing a series based on these comics, and I'm actually pretty excited to see what they do with that, and I'm curious to see if they try to connect the TV series with the show Lucifer, because, again, the comic books are connected, so I'm curious to see if they try to set the Netflix series in the same universe as the TV show Lucifer. I will say I do think the series should be set in either the late 80s or early 90s, because something I really love about the comics is sort of this, like, late 80s, early 90s punk aesthetic to it, or, like, goth rock aesthetic. I mean, Morpheus was specifically drawn to look like Robert Smith from The Cure, so I almost feel like there should be, like, Cure music on the soundtrack for the Netflix show when it happens. But yeah, I highly recommend this series, but that was my review on The Wake, the 10th and final volume of the original run of Neil Gaiman's Sandman series, and before I end this video, I want to cut to a short review that my friend Mark Allan Gunnells did on this volume.
Hello, Mark Allan Gunnells here. My friend Christian has asked me to do a short video review of the Sandman collection, The Wake. This was actually the very last story arc for the series. Now, later he did go on to do a few other Sandman-related things. He did a short illustrated novel called The Dream Hunter, and he did a couple of collections that sort of continue the series. But for the original run, this was the very last story arc. It came out when I was in college. I was reading it issue by issue as it came out. All the really explosive stuff took place in the previous collection, the Kindly ones. This was sort of a wrap-up, a chance for the readers who'd been such fans to really say goodbye to the series. And I actually thought it did that very well. It was very emotional. The artwork was gorgeous. A lot of characters that had appeared throughout the series sort of popped in for cameos. It really was a sending off of the series, and you could feel that it was also Neil Gaiman saying goodbye to the series. I actually do think the best thing about this particular story arc is that it is so emotional, and that it really does give you a sense of closure and sort of a breather so you can say goodbye to the characters you've come to love over the years. I really think he did a great job with that. And actually, the very last issue, The Tempest, which is sort of a sister story to Midsummer Night's Dream, which came earlier in the series, which deals with Shakespeare and his writing of The Tempest and his dealing with Morpheus the Sandman. I actually thought that was a great story to end on, because in a metaphorical way, it really summed up a lot of the themes of the series and a lot of what made the Sandman Morpheus who he was and what ultimately led him to make the decision he made that ended the series. So I do think it was a wonderful way to say goodbye to the series.